Okay, so I'm here. My name is Krystle Matar. I'm reading from my big chunky book, Legacy of the Brightwash. I'm going to be reading the third chapter because the first chapter is way too long, but that is up on my website, so I can post a link to that a little bit later if you're curious. So without any more intro, I'm going to jump right in. So chapter 3 is from Tasha's point of view. The Residential Institute for the Feral Tainted and Noncompliance, the Rift, stood on an island in the Brightwash, its massive stone walls constantly enshrouded in spray from the river. An iron fence had been built around the old stone structure, an extra layer to keep its residents contained. It stood like a monolith to the nation's past, when the continent was divided into countries and city-states, and war raged more often than not. Toshua smoked as he stood on the bridge, hoping to banish the pressure in his chest, but it was no use. The grounds were stark and empty, the stone denying foothold to any vegetation. He flicked his cigarillo into the Brightwash, sparing only a glance downriver. He could see the pilings jutting up from the bank from here. That girl, so small and tortured, hadn't left his thoughts. The photograph still sat in his pocket, tucked into his notebook. Such a little thing, a photograph, and yet it was heavier than any other burden he'd ever taken on before. With the cigarillo spent, he couldn't stall anymore. He marched himself forward, trying to brace himself against the headache that clamped down on the base of his skull. The tainted in the rift were kept contained not only by stone walls, iron fences, and the rushing river, but by a thick fog of protection that blocked the inmates and their visitors from using their talent. Though Toshue's own talent was so minimal he didn't need to register, he still felt the vice-like will blocking him from it. He wondered, as he had more than once, if the inmates got used to the sensation, if exposure to the vice took the pain away, or if they lived with the headache every moment of every day. The attendant was a small man, walking with a shuffling limp that made every step look painful. What he may have lacked in physical intimidation, he made up with the guards that flanked him, the pair of them armed with utilitarian Imberley pistols and heavy truncheons. "Good evening, Mr. Flynn," Toshua said, waiting at the gate. "You're late today, Mr. Blackwood," Flynn said. He settled his spectacles on the edge of his nose as he looked at Toshua expectantly. "Haven't much visiting time left." "I have an hour still." Flynn shrugged at him. Toshua reached for his tin badge, passing it through the gate. Flynn was the keeper of the paperwork. He scratched Toshua's name and badge number down with deliberate care. He passed the badge back and checked his watch, marking down the time beside Toshua's information. Only when those notes were made did Flynn nod at the guards. Toshua had to duck to fit through the small door. He pinned his badge back into place in the front of his jacket as he followed Flynn into the building. An attendant waited in a room behind a metal grate where Toshua turned over most of the contents of his pockets. He handed over his Imberley pistol, a heavier piece than the guards carried, the big cavalry knife that he'd had since he'd served in the Dominion military, his timepiece, his cigarillo case, his pack of matches, and the handful of coins he kept. The visiting rooms were arranged next to a long hallway that stretched along the outer wall. There was a door on each side of the room, both of them locking to keep the visitors and the inmates trapped inside. Each room was cut in half by a table and a strong metal grate, keeping inmates and visitors on their respective sides. Without access to talent, no one could run the brights. And the rooms were lit with oil lamps, which gave juddering dim light and too much heat. At least the autumn was fading into winter, and the rooms weren't so oppressively hot anymore. Toshua sat at the table and waited. An ever-present hum filtered through the massive walls, an indistinct roar of so many bodies living in one place, and the babbling of the river as it crested around the island. Toshua had come to appreciate all the noise. It used to be daunting, but he had learned that the constant barrage of sound lay like a cloak over the visiting rooms, making it hard for the guards outside to hear what was going on once they shut the door. Toshua looked up as the guards stomped in. Setting eyes on his son never ceased to hurt, the frustration and regret and disappointment and fear of the last 3 years tearing through him every time. Jason sat across from Toshway, looking small and weary on his side of the grate. Jason hadn't inherited his father's height and breadth. He looked more like his mother, short and slim, with warm gold skin and hair as black as pitch, and tawny-colored eyes that were somewhere in between his own startling amber hue and Kyo's warm brown. But seeing the girl made Toshway realize that he had forgotten what Kyo looked like. When he pictured her, he saw Jason, but Jason's face was a blend of the two of them, Toshway and Kyo both. The girl made him remember Kyo's face, scrubbed of features that Toshway had contributed to their son. He remembered now how full and heart-shaped Kyo's mouth was, and her ears overly large for her face. He remembered Kyo compulsively smoothing her hair over her ears, and Toshway, in his youth and ignorance, teasing her about them because he liked making her blush. There were no new bruises on Jason this time. His eye was less swollen, and the blood that had turned the sclera into a model of white and red was starting to fade. The other bruise, the one that came from a hit to the jaw that probably knocked a few teeth loose, had almost faded completely. They sat in silence, staring at each other through the grate, until the guard retreated out of the room. "You look like shit, as usual," Toshway muttered. Jason rolled his eyes at him, leaning back in his chair to balance on the two rear legs. "Sorry, I didn't have time to dress up for you." "Your eye is getting better, at least." Jason's hand moved up to the side of his face, but he stopped short before touching it. He clenched his fists, and Toshway saw the bruises on his knuckles. Were those new? He couldn't remember. "Remind me what happened to it," Toshway pressed. "I fell and broke the fall with your eye." Jason scowled. "You can save your interrogations for your cases." Toshway bit back the frustration. He shuffled through his pockets instead, pulling out his various offerings, 1 silver crown, a handful of plump figs, and a slice of dense bread that made with nuts and grains, wrapped in muslin cloth to keep it clean. The grate was easily pulled up from the table, just enough to keep it clean. Oops. The grate was easily pulled up from the table, just enough to squeeze the items through. A few snacks seemed like such a small contribution to Jason's life, but Toshway had to do something. Jason was Toshway's flesh, his bone, his blood, but he was locked up like an animal, and there was nothing Toshway could do about that. He watched Jason diminish, every lost pound and every bruise gained, chipping a piece of Toshway away. One day he would know how to fix it, how to get Jason out. Until then, fruit and bread would have to suffice. Jason leaned forward again, the front legs of his chair thumping back down on the floor as he reached for the silver first, stashing it away into a pocket in the rags that passed for clothing here. "Did you get any more letters from your mother?" Toshway asked. Jason unwrapped the muslin from the heavy bread, breaking off a few pieces and chewing them before answering. "This morning, just the one." "What does she write about?" "Nothing. It's babbling on paper. I don't ever recall her babbling. In fact, when I try to remember her, I only remember her being quiet, standing back away from everything, as if she was afraid I'd break her. I think she was afraid that she would break you. No one ever taught her to control her talent." Jason scowled at the answer, and Toshway could feel the familiar shape of the conversation and the way it was going to flow. It always went this way. A few questions, a bit of small talk, and it all somehow built into a fight. "How is she?" Toshway asked, trying to head off the fight. Maybe if he changed the subject often enough, he could spend the whole hour with his son without either of them getting angrier than they already were. "Your mother, other than babbling, I mean." Jason sighed, taking a fig next. He twisted off the hard bit that was left of the stem, pushing it back under the bent grate. "She's going to be retired soon. She said she had 3 miscarriages in a row, but now she's pregnant again. She says she hopes this one will survive, but she isn't sure it has a chance. Whatever happens to the babe, they'll retire her." "That's good news." "Is it?" "It must be. Maybe she'll be released." Jason leaned closer to the grate, eyes wide and intense. "Will she? What happens to talented when they're retired from the breeding program? Do they get assigned? Do you monitor any women who have been retired?" The thought, and what Jason was implying, gave Toshway pause. "No, I don't have any, but that doesn't mean anything. All my cases are low strength. A woman strong enough to make it to the breeding program would get a much bigger assignment than anything we keep in Brickheart." "Are you sure?" Why, Jason? What have you heard? Jason shrugged, twisting off the top of another fig. Nothing specifically. He popped the fig into his mouth, and Toshua could hear him crunching on the seeds. He'd never gotten used to that feeling, but Jason loved figs. I've been wondering. I was tempted to hope I would see her again, but hope seems such a stupid thing in this world. The words cut through Toshua. His one job as a father was to protect his son from the hard world around them, but he had failed. He had so miserably failed. Fighting was almost better than this, because at least when they were fighting, rage and frustration filled all the hollow places in him and left no room for shame. I'll find out, he croaked. I'll find out what happens to them. Jason nodded. Toshua tried to remember how old Jason was when last he saw his mother. He wondered if Jason even remembered what she looked like. If Toshua didn't have a firm memory of her anymore, how could Jason remember someone he had last seen when he was a child? Toshua's eyes were drawn down to the dark lines across Jason's collarbone, stark against his pale skin. Jason noticed him staring, and his hand went to the tattoo, pushing aside the ragged collar of his shirt. Blackwood J 11658-753. The first number named as crime. 1 was the code for feral, refusal to register. The second marked the province he belonged to, 1 again for Yale, the first province to have the authority at all. The third was his identity as a prisoner in the Rift. Toshua had wondered more than once if that meant the authority had really processed over 600,000 people into the Rift or buildings like it. Jason seemed to think the numbers were random. Toshua hoped he was right. Do they tattoo you all in the same place? Toshua asked, nodding to the mark. Jason nodded, popping the last fig into his mouth. Everyone. You don't see anyone with tattoos anywhere else? Another shrug. Of course, but they had them before they got here, or they get them after. But the authority gives you the same style tattoo, always in the same place? Yes, Jason huffed. Why? Why do you care about tattoos all of a sudden? Toshua reached for his notebook, but he muttered a curse when he realized he'd handed it over to the attendant. I found a child on the bank of the river. She had a tattoo on the back of her neck, 3 sets of 4-digit numbers. Why don't you ask her where she got it? Don't be a shit, Toshua muttered. You think I wouldn't have tried that if I could? When I found her, she was dead. The smirk died fast, and Jason leaned forward, pushing the muslin back through the gap and smoothing the grate back into place. I didn't realize dead children were part of your job. They aren't, but I can't do nothing. You always did have a soft spot for little kids. Fuck, that was so frustrating. All the other kids liked you so damn much, and they were always asking to come visit because they wanted to see you. It made me so mad because I could never seem to get along with you, but there you were, second father to half the fucking neighborhood. Toshua sighed, folding the muslin and tucking it back into his pocket. How could he explain that the reason he was so infuriated by Jason's choices was because he loved his son so damn much? He watched Jason stubbornly throw himself into his mistakes. Every time, Toshua desperately wanted to pull his son back into a safer course, but every time, Jason bucked and fought like a stubborn horse. Do any inmates ever get pregnant? Toshua asked instead. Jason shrugged. Of course they do. You know what people do when they're all locked up together. It helps pass the time. What happens to the children? Jason glanced back over his shoulder still for a moment. It was easy to tell what he was thinking. How close were the guards? How much did they hear? I don't know. I don't see any of them here. There's all kinds of rumors. What kind of rumors? Why? Jason asked, swinging back to Toshua, leaning in close. Do you think she came from here? I don't know. She was just downriver, and I thought, what kind of rumors, Jason? Jason shook his head, leaning back again. I'm sure the authority takes them. We're all tainted here. After all, a bunch of bad meat. If people are making babies, they'll be tainted too, so the authority must want them. Right? What else have you heard, though? Jason opened his mouth to answer, but the guard came stomping into the room. Jason shot to his feet like he was caught at something he wasn't supposed to be doing, wiping crumbs off his hand. The guard ignored the crumbs and the sweet smell of figs and patting Jason's pocket quickly and finding the silver crown. With it in her pocket, she marched Jason back out again. Fucking hell, Toshwin muttered, pushing himself to his feet. Flynn escorted him back out. He lit a cigarillo as soon as he had them back, cloaking himself in the sweet-smelling tobacco smoke. Was it the rumors that inspired the fear in Jason, or merely the defiant act in spreading them? Wind whipped off the river, tugging Tashua's clothes. Flynn's keys unlocked the gate, and Tashua stepped through, released from the headache, at least. Have a good night, Mr. Blackwood. Tashua stopped. He turned to the little man, looking past the crooked spectacles to look Flynn in the eye. My son is imprisoned in the rift, Mr. Flynn. I come here 3 or 4 times a week to see him, and most of the time he has fresh bruises. No new ones this time, thank the North Star. As long as my son is in this place, I don't have good nights. So that's the end of chapter 3 for Legacy of the Brightwash. I'm going to say hi to Pam and Clayton for coming by, and none of them asked questions, which is rude, so I'm just going to babble about my book instead. This, as everyone can probably tell from the chapter that I read, it is a dark story, and it explores some pretty heavy themes, like the commodification of humans and turning them into resources. But I think what made it really special to me was it became a story also about the different ways that people can love each other, paternally and romantically and in a friendship, and all the bonds between the people in this story is what makes them strong and lets them stand against a system that is using them as a resource. So it's dark, and I didn't realize how dark it was until other people started reading it. So now I feel like I need to warn people that it's as dark as it is, but it is also about love and the redemptive power of love in all its many forms. So I hope that that comes through in Tashua's arc, and how loving his son through something dramatic for the both of them. His son is imprisoned as an enemy of the state, basically, heals them and the rift between them. So that's my book. Oh, I see. Clayton. When is book 2 out? I just want to say a shout out to Clayton that he won 2nd place in Best Worst Lines, and that does not surprise me at all, because the power of Clayton Snyder's snark and wit is astounding. Book 2 is a work in progress. When I started writing book 1, Brightwash, I pulled back from things that I really cared about, because I thought that would make it more commercial and more marketable, and I thought it would give me a better chance of making a splash in the writing world. And as I was revising it along the way, when you write a book that's 220,000 words, it takes a lot of time to revise it. As I was revising it along the way, I felt like I was starting to mourn for some of the things that I was flinching away from, like the really messy character relationships, and having queer characters was something that I was afraid of. But so that's a very long way of saying that everything I thought I was writing about changed kind of at the last minute. So book 2 is taking longer than I thought it would. I'm hoping that I can start throwing it at beta readers in a couple of months, but it's going to be another long one, so that process is very long. So the short answer to that very long question was, I don't know when it's coming out. However, I'm hoping to also do some shorter stories in this world. It's kind of a Victorian era gas lamp world where I hesitate to call it steampunk because I don't lean very heavily on technology. And it's also not Steam that's running anything, it's magic. And the people who are able to use that magic have become a resource for the Empire. So it's a really fun world to explore, just how the Victorian era is both familiar and so strange to our modern sensibilities. And I like to play with that contrast. Clayton asks, how many hearts are too many to crush with this book? And I'm telling you, there are no such thing as too many hearts to break, Clayton. And you should know that by now. We've been friends long enough that you know that I'm aiming to hurt people with this. And yeah, I mean, tears for the writer means tears for the reader, right? That's the advice everyone gives. So I've cried a lot over these people. So I'm hoping you people cry too, because I feed on it and it makes me a better writer. So I guess that's about all I have to say. So this is the last reading for CorinCon. CorinCon is all wrapped up after me. And so I want to thank everybody who participated. There were some amazing panels, and I didn't catch them all because there's so many of them, but the ones that I did catch were amazing. And the ones that I managed to get back to after the fact were also amazing. So definitely go check out the schedule at CorinCon2020.com, and all the YouTube stuff is going to be up indefinitely. Thank you to all the volunteers who are working behind the scenes, who made all the Zoom stuff totally palatable to people like me who have no clue how to use Zoom. So thank you, Taya. And thanks again to Virginia, who's the force of nature behind all of this stuff. Like, the effort that she puts into this is amazing. And Pam as well, thank you for putting it together and inviting me on to do the reading. And all the other moderators, and just everybody has been amazing. So thank you all very much. And we hope to hear from you later. And that's about it for me.